Anything I say here is my opinion only, doesn't reflect the opinions of any of the groups with whom I am and maybe affiliated now, in the past, or in the future. With a general outline that goes as follows. First, I'll talk a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about conflict, protracted crises, poverty, food insecurity. How do these interact with each other? I'll go quickly through this because I realize most of this is known to you, but I just wanted to anchor this brief talk. And then because we're focusing on food systems, I'll very briefly talk about food systems. And then, as asked, I will talk a little bit about interventions. I'm not totally familiar with DFID interventions, which I actually know a little bit when it was ODA, before the big change. Most of what I will be talking about is going to be also derived from three important sources. I mean, the reference material is essentially sources that are close to the FAO because of the nature of my relationship with the high-level panel of experts. I endorse this data. The sources from a recent book that Eckhart and myself and our colleague Rachel Baum have just published on agriculture and conflict. It's just out 3 days ago in CABI. And I urge every one of you to acquire a copy. The third is a recent document on food systems and nutrition. These are important works, in my opinion, that can serve as a basis. Let's see a little bit what we say about that. In a recent work on the future of food and agriculture, FAO mapped the big challenges that we have with the number that go with that. And towards the end there, I highlighted it in here, we learned that about 500 million people in 20 countries and are affected, their food security and nutrition are affected by conflict and protracted crisis, and their indication there is in build resilience. So it's interesting, we're always talking about resilience today, and that's an important part of what we do. That is really hot off the press. That's the new state of food security and nutrition in the world. Let's look a little bit at what the key messages are in here. So a rise in world hunger, a reversal of trend. Scaling up is important here because most of us work on projects. Scaling up is a part. Strength and resilience, so adaptive capacity of food systems, livelihoods, nutrition, and the solutions, an increased partnership, multi-year, large-scale funding. So we seem to know generally where we want to go without really knowing fully how do we get there. I'm hoping that today we can talk a little bit about how do we get there. So what are these conflicts and protracted crises? Conflicts, and I do not need to explain that any further, but protracted crisis, I'm using Harmer's and McRae definition. That's environments in which a significant proportion of the population, so not only a few, so a significant proportion, acutely vulnerable to death, disease, and disruption of livelihood over a prolonged period of time. So there's a health component, and there is a time component in here, and the livelihood component. Now, these are important components when we come to map and to plan. And they have, of course, as we all know, short-term and long-term consequences. In fact, if you want to look at fragile and conflict-affected countries, you put all of this together. And if you use, for example, the World Bank's definitions and their list, you end up not with 20 countries, but with 37 countries, some of which are very small, some of which are bigger. Do these countries have any commonalities? Agriculture is very often linked. There's been a lot of work on agriculture and conflict in protracted crisis, but there is little work that's been done on food systems. And agriculture is very often used as a proxy or is conflated with food systems. People have been interested. We're one of the first people who are interested in these issues. But very often we conflate agriculture with food systems. And we know a lot about agriculture, as a driver of crisis, the impact of crisis on agriculture. When we come to talk about food systems and livelihood, we won't find a lot in the literature. We find a lot on agriculture in itself. The climate's effect on farming, on farming and on rainfall, etc., but little on the food system as a whole. Are we really warranted to look at agriculture and conflicts and crises? It's interesting. We've never asked ourselves that question. Do they have commonalities when it comes to agriculture? Does the fact of having a big rural population make you more predisposed for conflicts and crises, or maybe there is no difference to that? So are we really justified when we're looking at that? I mean, statistically, we're not. Let me just say, like in pure statistical terms, you look at that, we're not. But you can see that there are some patterns in which the black dots here being countries in conflicts and crises, or fragile and conflict-affected countries, and the gray ones are all other countries. And if you look at the Gini coefficient of income, for example, or at rural population and rural poverty rates, and rural population versus rural poverty rate, we don't have a very, very clear equivocal trend, but we seem to see some broad patterns that emerge in here. This has to do with a lot of issues. In these circumstances, any shock that comes on top of already fragile social environments and biophysical environments are going to have more consequences. What are those consequences? This is a table that comes out from the high-level panel's work, which essentially shows that climate is a threat multiplier on malnutrition. And of course, we mostly felt that, and now we have the data to prove it, where there is higher prevalence of malnutrition in children, for example, where you have a crisis and protracted conflict. Conflict will slow down the reduction in undernutrition. That's also the data that's the evidence for this. The evidence is here, and that comes from IFPRI, but is pretty clear. Whenever you have countries that do not have major civil conflict, then the rates of reduction of undernutrition over time the rate is faster than the ones where you've had conflict, where there is almost no change. Why should we really want the food systems approach in there? I kind of led you to that by saying that agriculture alone isn't sufficient when you look at that. So let's look a little bit and very briefly at why a food system approach. We're interested in food and in livelihood, so there are food doesn't only come from agriculture, it comes from a system, so systems thinking in here, and the processes, institutions, environment, preparation, and consumption, so diets are important, and they're put under stress. Let's look at what we have, the big chunks of the food system, the big subsystems of the food system, the food supply chains, which include the production system, storage, distribution, processing, retail and market, then the food environment. And I love that. We knew that for a while, but Jess and her colleagues really focused on this issue, the whole idea of the food environment. So the physical proximity, but also the promotion, the quality and the safety, all that environment that makes us consume the way we consume. The first question is, why do we want to build resilient food systems rather than others? And the reason is, of course, because of food and nutrition security is important, but also because of the livelihoods of people who work in the food system. When it gets broken down itself. So that is our justification for working in food system rather than in other options. So what have we been doing so far? We have been addressing kind of the four pillars of food security rather than food systems. I really can't find a lot of evidence for systematically addressing food systems. But I can find evidence for a reasonably good approach based on food security, and more recently food security and nutrition. For example, if you look at the four pillars, not to be too complicated here, we've been addressing food availability whenever we have conflict and protracted crisis. One, by emergency relief food supply, and that everybody is aware of this. The WFP is doing this for Syrian refugees in Lebanon and elsewhere. More recently, we've done that elsewhere. Everybody is involved in that. We raise money. It requires a lot of money. And also, we've been trying to improve small-scale agriculture through input supply, especially seed aid. Seed aid seems to be extremely popular, and also through technical support. And there are potential issues with this, okay? I mean, that's what I want to talk about here. So that's very good. It's impossible to tell people, no, don't do good, don't send food to people who are hungry. But we need to be very aware of the issues, and these are issues I have personally lived with. And for example, it can create or reinforce power imbalances and control over the most vulnerable population. I personally, for example, I can talk about during the civil war in Lebanon, food aid could only be delivered through local warlords. Let's be very clear about this. There is no system that is, disengaged from the political events on the grounds that is, actually taking these trucks of food and distributing them. You have to go through, let's say, if not to say directly warlords, but influential people in certain regions to be able to reach others. Now, that gives them a lot of power, like tremendous power. So we're kind of complicit in that power imbalance. And we need to keep thinking about it, because this is something that has obsessed me and bothered me for a very long time. We seem to be doing good, do no harm, but then again, the people are getting strong. And emergency food relief supplies, it assumes that farming sometimes, the farming has stopped. And, and in fact, farming hasn't stopped. Okay? Just before coming here, 3 days ago, I contacted my colleagues and friends in Yemen, with whom I work on food security by remote, because I cannot go there at the present time. And it's interesting, you need to know also that while there is a humanitarian and food crisis in Yemen, if you have money, there is food. 2, the cultivation of khat has not ceased. Okay, so, that's agriculture. And that could, in a theoretical world that we create in our mind, then people should be producing food. And there are reasons for this. Also, in Lebanon, during the wars and the conflict, agriculture increases. In Afghanistan, it increases. But you produce what? Cannabis, opium. Okay, so you want to be linked to the capital market. You want to just make money, because if you have money, then there is food. Okay, and that, in relief, we know. We know now, for example, it's better to give people money to buy food and leave the system work, rather than give them, at least if we don't know that, we're trying it out. And it does seem to have some positive impact. So this assumption that agriculture stopped is not totally true. It may be lessened in certain regions. Eckhart has done some work, and myself with the same person, a friend, by remote sensing. Eckhart has a great paper on that, on how agriculture was actually used by ISIS in order to fund its own work. And I'm sure I don't want to speak for him, but I'm sure he can raise that. And also, these improving small-scale agriculture input supply may have a very limited significance, and it did. I worked with desert gardens, and there was a lot of funds raised. This was like nearly insignificant. In the Saharan refugee camps, you need to import every single item of food you eat, and you will continue, and we're continuing to do that 30 years later. So, is it really worth it? Why are we really doing it if it is just symbolic and doesn't change very much? And seed aid, and I point you to that great article by Sperling and Maguire, which is called Persistent Myth About Seed Aid, which really unpacks completely the issue of seed aid. And I really would I'm not going to repeat what they say, but it's a fantastic article, which at least has the courage to come and say, hey, listen, here, that's a very, very attractive option, but it may not be what you want, and for the following reasons. And I do agree from my own experience with that. And of course, sometimes we say we need to purchase locally, but this can be extremely expensive. It can damage local food system irreversibly. Then Eckhart here can talk about Iraq way better than I can do, but I've worked in Iraq a little bit, and I can assure you that the general understanding there is that the local farming systems were completely destroyed by the war, of course, on the one hand, but also, on the other hand, by the oil for food program and by food aid. Also, when we talk about food aid or agricultural aid, we tend to look at the whole country, like Syria. But it's very multi-layered, and it's not enough to work in Yemen. I would say, people are shy to pronounce the words, but I'm taking my courage here and saying you need perhaps a class-based approach, different classes of people. Nobody wants to do class thinking anymore for fear of being labeled, but I'm really urging people, and perhaps a regional. The narratives, by the way, that we hear when we keep hearing about how important that is, does not have enough granulosity in it. We hear generally, we have contributed to supporting agriculture in the region, and etc. And there is no granulosity. Who are we supporting? Big agriculture versus or small agriculture. Sometimes it's much easier, and I have worked with that, to work with people who can actually respond to you. Not people who cannot understand what you're saying, who do not have the ability to access technology, but these are the neediest. So there are choices that you need to do. Do you meet your KPIs, or do you actually try to be impactful on the ground? And of course, there are problems of scales and scalability. Having 6 goats in a Yemeni village is not the same as having an economy based on pastoralism and agro-pastoralism. Because most of what we've been doing was to deal with availability. Now, the issue of access, of course, is a strongly economic issue and logistical issue. So what we've done with that historically is livelihood support. So resilience of livelihood, providing work, sustainability, diversification, employment opportunities. But we somehow, whenever we mention the food issue and the agriculture issue, it's always aimed at the rural. Most of the people in our world are, in fact, in the urban. The urban fringes are also very poor. It is true that poverty in the rural areas appears to be higher, and it's very difficult with the flow of people to really determine who's urban and who's living where. And we've worked a lot on enhancing export-led agriculture because we believe this helps a lot in building livelihoods. And we've also done a lot of cash transfers and social protection and improving the value chains and markets, especially in post-conflict. I have personal experience with each and every one of these. And I can say quickly to you that there are issues. First of all, we aim at the rural and we forget very much the urban, peri-urban, and that the people are very mobile. The DFID's experience on cash transfer, and I wanted to use that because there are other experiences, but your own evaluation of your programs on your own website point at the fact that there are targeting issues. We need to really rethink that. And also I can talk a little bit about cards versus purchases versus identifying shops. We have a lot of things that have been happening with the whole refugee crisis in Lebanon. Also, that projects that emerge from short-term emergency situations are great projects. We're doing them. We have 3 years. It's an emergency. They just don't turn into long-term projects that are needed for value chain improvement. So, looking at food systems, looking at their value chain improvement, long-term, big issues. They don't. And of course, small producers can very often become pawns. And here I'm referring specifically to the issue of enhancing export-led agriculture. I have worked a lot on agriculture under occupation. I've written about Gaza and I'm very familiar with the situation in the West Bank. We come in with a project to grow strawberries in Gaza, for example, because that will make 50 women or 20 women live. And then there is a blockade, and then all the strawberries, rot. And we do the same with cut flowers, also in Gaza because of the weather. But this is all dependent, fully and completely, on whether the Israelis will open the Erez crossing. And there are deals that happen between the exporters who can only be Israelis, and it's a difficult situation. Okay, so while perhaps donors come in with a lot of goodwill and say, we're going to integrate you into the market, the food system market, the outcome is very often not the one that we wanted. You notice how the number of the bullet points shrinks as we're moving towards more complex, away from availability into, for example, food utilization, diets and nutrition and clean water and sanitation. Then there are 2 big issues here. One is that the people who provide the water are not the people who provide the food and emergency supply. So we're looking at 2 different entities, and there's Jim, there's a nexus here waiting to be analyzed, and they don't really talk. And when I was working in Yemen, UNICEF was one of the big water people, and other institutions were working with food, and you need water to cook, you need clean water to be able to retain the food that you're eating if you get to eat it. So all of these interact, and they just don't come together. The same thing happens in Lebanon's reconstruction. This is very common in the West Bank, in Gaza. So very little integration. Also, because we're moving immediately towards calories, we think calories, we haven't really done a lot on the stability of food, because that requires longer-term systems thinking. And it also requires ex-ante commitment. And we're not present in governments before there is a conflict and crisis for many reasons. We're not present, and we have to assume that the governments themselves have the presence of mind to actually prepare for a crisis. And my experience is that they're not. The issue of stability relies on a preemptive commitment that is often not there, and therefore that's not something. That is just to remind ourselves that the food system is more than just the individual food, the availability part, and that any action we need to take can happen at different levels. And in this slide, we have examples of policies that are negative and examples of policies that can be positive, which will guide us towards what to do, what we can do at several places in the food systems and what we cannot do. If you look a little bit at our own work as development organizations, we start planning, but we also put a set of preconditions, long-term preconditions on what we need to have in order to be able to be successful. And they're a long list. For example, we want to recommend to the countries in crisis that they should have community-based initiatives that also involve the state and the private sectors. How do you actually do that? How do you go to a country, to a state, to a government, and say, okay, guys, we've looked at it, we're going to give you some aid in here, but we would like this to be community-based initiatives that also involve you and the private sector. I mean, you can't do that. You can, but it's not going to happen, because it can happen only in this little project that is detached from the rest of the world that we are setting up. It's not going to happen in other places. Something else is going to happen, and we don't really know what it is because we're not studying it. We're only studying what we came up with. We know, that's what we need to do. For example, some of them are a bit weird. Reestablish order and law for business. Countries, conflict, crisis, divided, torn apart, people bombing you left, right, and center, and then we're going to say, we're going to give that for a project, but you need to establish law, because we cannot reestablish that law as foreign funding. I'm thinking DFID here. We can ask for that, but that goes without saying. It's a truism that you need to have that. So some of this is a very ambitious agenda. And it's interesting that a lot of these questions that we're asking are associated with some political dimensions. For example, it's a question, DFID here is part of the UK government. And it's interesting because people ask themselves the question, and when I was representing indirectly, funds or using funds from the UK government in Yemen, I was very often confronted to this question. How can you support our enemies on the one hand and come and give us money with the other hand? Have you asked yourself this? It's an interesting question. People ask it. I don't know if somebody has brought that to you as bluntly as I am saying, but it's not something that is totally new. If you don't know, you need to know that people may take your money because, who spits on money, right? It's money, it's food, it's anything you can have. But what does it help in when you're looking at others? In Lebanon, for example, the whole of Europe now insists on keeping the refugees in Lebanon until a political situation emerges in Syria, not with the Assad regimes, all understandable, justifiable, but the borders of Europe are closed to refugees. The mobility is important only locally, within local countries. And people realize these contradictions. They do realize them, but they're polite. Sometimes they don't say anything, and there's also a power differential that's pretty enormous. And so you don't want to upset the people who have so much power in the world over you and your livelihood and your country. So these may not be said as bluntly as I'm trying to say them. And also we tend to forget a little bit some of the issues. For example, for me, reading the two documents of K4D, on one of agriculture in conflict and one of food systems in conflict, I was actually surprised that the word Palestine or Gaza appears nowhere. How come you have a situation where you have a war, an occupation that's been going on for 70 years, and it's never used in a formal document of DFID as an example of what could happen in situations of conflict and protracted crisis? Isn't that a bit weird? These are issues to put our house in order here that we will need to confront, so we don't keep doing the same thing and perhaps expecting a different outcome every time while the outcome has a tendency to remain the same. We're trying to create a food system that works in conflicts and crises, and we seem to want to do it independently from the larger system, the larger political system, the larger economic system in which it exists. Can we really do that? By the way, it goes against the basic law of systems. Maybe we want to take our courage with both hands and put it on the table and say, okay, let's see how we can tweak these things so at least we can produce a better outcome from whatever system we want to implement.